So should I just sit on the front row?
You can stand there. It's not going to be too long. Whatever you feel comfortable. Okay, perfect. And then at the end, everyone's going to be talking and leaving, but I'm going to go up and just give them another little housekeeping thing to mull on. And then for questions, it seems like the best thing that's been working, what everybody's been doing anyway, is just, people will have questions, but they need the mic. Otherwise, the virtual audience can't hear them. If somehow someone says something without the mic, repeat it, because then the virtual audience will hear. Otherwise, the chat will be flooded, and they'll be like, I can't hear what they say, So
Okay, I will
just
try my best
try
to
your best,
remember, and feel free to call out and
I
remind
will.
me.
I'll call out. And then I will also, they will have questions for you on the chat. I'm trying to, tell them to upvote so we can consolidate to just a few. But if there's an opportunity throughout your workshop to be like, oh, I wonder what the virtual people are thinking, anything that kind of brings them in just a tiny bit. Like, we'll take a few in the room and let's take one or two on virtual. And then I'll be the spokesperson for their questions.
So I'm supposed to be taking questions throughout, or I can do it at the end?
You can do it at the end,
okay.
If that's how you feel most comfortable. In fact, I can announce that if you would like.
Yeah, just because, well, I don't know. I also like not just lecturing for 2 hours straight. How much time have people been allowing?
I mean, people have been intending to only take them at the end, but then they get carried away, and then it happens in between. So what I could say is just, Stacy will, when she's available to take, she'll pause throughout a few times. She may pause to take a few questions, but we will definitely have time at the end.
Yeah, say may because I might forget or I might get in the flow. Yeah.
She may pause to take questions throughout the lecture. Is it a lecture? Did I say lecture? Presentation. Throughout the presentation. Right. And then at the end, there will be an opportunity for in-person and virtual questions.
And so how long have people typically been allowing at the end? I just realized I need
10
to
minutes.
set up my clock.
When they're taking questions throughout, like Dick Schwartz took questions throughout, and then there was just like 5 minutes at the end.
Okay. I'll try to remember to take questions throughout.
You might need a breath, and sometimes it's a good way to just get a breath.
And to just not be talking at.
Exactly. That's what people have been saying. Oh, I've been talking at you. Let me hear a question.
Yeah.
I'm holding on to the mic because we've had some people who want to co-facilitate with you, and so we just try to, thank you, or thank you. So,
how interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone told me there was a really long question yesterday, and that person was talking about Jesus. And I was like, oh gosh, what am I going to do if that happens?
I know. Yeah, it'll go fine. We've had all kinds of little bumps that they all go fine.
I do want to ask you one more thing. How do you pronounce your first name?
Oh, Alicia.
Okay, I didn't know if it was Alicia or
In Spain,
Alicia.
if we were in Seville, it would be Alicia, but here, Alicia.
Okay, so if I have a question for you.
Sure, just Alicia.
Thanks, Alicia.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. It's great to see you all here, seeing familiar faces. I hope you all enjoyed this morning's keynote with Nedra Glover-Tawwab. Was it amazing? If you missed it, or if you missed any of the content from the last few days, you can rewatch it. So everything that you've been seeing or not seeing is available on the Symposium Attendee Hub for up to 2 weeks after Sunday, after the end of the symposium. Remember that if you have any technical questions, and this might be mainly for the virtual folks, if you have any technical questions or other questions, the FAQ page on the on-site guide or the Attendee Hub or in the mobile app that you may already have downloaded will probably answer most of your questions. The live workshops will have a live CE eval at the very end on Sunday. You'll all receive an email link where you can go on and you can take all of your evaluations at the same time, get your CE certificate, and just save it and download it and save it. And so you'll be able to access that on Sunday. For those of you who are virtual, I think most of you know the drill by now. I feel like we're family. We've been together for a few days, but just if you have questions for Stacy Friedenthal today, you can ask those in the Q&A section and just continue chatting in the chat section and upvote one another's questions in the Q&A so that we don't have repeats of questions, and then I can easily see them and be your point person in the room for your questions to try to get those answered. And Stacy's going to be probably maybe pausing throughout, depending on her flow, to see what questions you have here in person and also in the virtual. But definitely at the end, there'll be time allotted for questions. So this is workshop 409, Fostering Hope in Suicidal Clients with Stacy Friedenthal. Stacy is Associate Professor at University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. She's also a psychotherapist in private practice and author of Helping the Suicidal Person. In addition, she's created a website called Speaking of Suicide. Without further ado, welcome, Stacy.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, good. What was that? Okay, can you hear me now in the back? Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up in the very, very back, so I'm going to take that to mean yes. Whew, I have to take a deep breath because, pardon, this might be TMI, but I had to use the restroom and the line was so long. So I thought, well, I am presenting, I shouldn't be completely late, so I went all the way back to my room, and then the line for the elevator was so long. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I made it right on time, just on time. So welcome, everybody, and if you took a while too because of lines, then you have my simpatico. What I am going to be talking about today, I just want to give you an overview, is hope, safety, and survival, and then beyond safety and survival. I'm going to talk about tips and techniques that you can use with clients who have suicidal thoughts. And then I'm going to close with information about maintaining your own hope. Because sometimes when we work with clients who have suicidal thoughts, it can be a campaign on their part to convince us that the situation is hopeless. And it's important for us to continue to hold hope, even if the client doesn't have it. And then there will be Q&A, and as Alicia said, I may take questions throughout. It's just going to depend on what the groove is like and the vibe and whether I need to have a sip of water and all of that. So let me begin. Hope, the poets tell us, is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings in the tune without words and never stops at all. Unfortunately, we know that's not true. Hope, the politicians tell us, is that stubborn thing inside us that insists, despite all evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us, so long as we have the courage to keep reaching, to keep working, to keep fighting. And at the risk of grandiosity, because I am not as eloquent as Emily Dickinson or Barack Obama, I say in my book, Helping the Suicidal Person, that hope is not only the antidote to suicidality, but its antithesis. With hope, people tend to not become convinced that their only option is to die. The thing is, if you say any of these very hopeful things to anybody who has suicidal thoughts, at least if you say them in the wrong context or prematurely or when they're in the midst of telling you otherwise, you might get punched in the mouth. And I personally wouldn't like that. So the trick is to try to sneak it in, mostly. sometimes to be explicit, but sometimes to sneak it in. And so when we're doing the suicide risk assessment, we can ask some hope-based questions. Oops, I'm sorry, I just realized that I didn't do this whole slide. So I also want to say that hope can be restated as reasons for living, somebody having meaning in life, somebody having a positive future orientation. And hope, if you want to get technical about it, is considered to be goals plus pathways to reaching those goals, plus agency, which would be the ability to use those pathways to reach those goals. And much of the literature on helping people with suicidal thoughts, especially on research of this population, focuses on hopelessness and not hope, and assessing hopelessness and recognizing a person's despair. I absolutely 100% agree with that. In solution-focused brief therapy and in some practices of motivational interviewing, they say not to go into hopelessness, because going into hopelessness can then trigger can trigger focusing on hopelessness, and what you focus on expands. However, I think it's very important to be a witness to people who have feelings of hopelessness, because nobody else lets them talk about it. You know, if they say to somebody, which isn't entirely common because half of people with suicidal thoughts don't tell people, but if they say to a family member or a friend, there's no hope, things will never get better, the very first thing the other person says is, there is hope, things will get better, most of the time. I mean, obviously I can't speak for all the billions of people in the world, but a very common reaction is to try to talk the person out of their feelings of hopelessness. So I do believe that it's important to bear witness to somebody's feelings of hopelessness and to explore those feelings of hopelessness, but then also, as I said, to try to sneak in hope. We can sneak in hope, we can convey hopefulness without being invalidating, without minimizing what the person is experiencing. And even just listening to somebody in their hopelessness can by itself engender hope in some people. You know, obviously I wish that were a cure for everybody. I wish it were that simple. But letting somebody be heard, hearing them with empathy, and truly listening can, for some people, help them to feel hopeful that they're not alone. It can help them tap into their own hope, and all of these are important. And then, now having given my caveat that we don't want to just foist hope on people without bearing witness to their hopelessness, let me say, and I'm seeing, this is lovely, there's a mirror back there so I can see my slide, and I'm seeing that I forgot to advance when I was talking about the other definitions of hopelessness. You would think having the computer in front of me would be enough, but no, I have to look way back there at the backwards reflection on the mirror to realize that I forgot to advance. So, of course, when we know that someone has suicidal thoughts, well, first of all, we may not know, and the most important thing is to ask and to not rely on people to volunteer that they're having suicidal thoughts. A study came out just a few months ago that showed that 40% of people in therapy who have suicidal thoughts don't tell the therapist. That's very sobering and, quite frankly, horrifying to me, because I want to know. How can we help if we don't know? And the reasons for people not telling us tend to be fear. And anyone know what's the number one thing clients tend to fear if they have suicidal thoughts? Exactly. I didn't need the microphone. I didn't need Alicia to hand the microphone for that, because you all spoke very loudly. Hospitalization. And it's just such a common fear. There's a myth that we are mandatory reporters of people with suicidal thoughts. We are not mandatory reporters. We do have a duty to protect, but the difference between mandatory reporting and duty to protect is that we can use discretion. You know, we can listen to somebody tell us that they have suicidal thoughts. We can listen to somebody tell us that they have thought of ways to do it, that they have even, depending on context, they may have the means, but if they don't have the intent to act, and even if they have the intent to act, if they don't have the intent to act soon, then we don't have to involve other people. Whereas with mandatory reporting, you don't get to make that choice. You just, you hear what's happening in terms of like child abuse, and you have to make a report. So, whoa, that would have been really lovely if I had poured my whole glass of water on my computer in the middle of a presentation. So, the first thing we have to do is to ask. And I am not suggesting that we start with, how did you get through your most recent suicidal crisis? But that we start with the basics. And the basic would be, do you have suicidal thoughts? And you don't have to be like, hi, my name is Stacy. Do you have suicidal thoughts? But it is important to ask, and to ask explicitly and directly, and to say the words suicidal, or do you have thoughts of killing yourself or of ending your life? Because if you ask, do you have thoughts of harming yourself, or do you have thoughts of hurting yourself, that's not asking about suicidal thoughts. And not only is it not asking about suicidal thoughts, because self-harm, a lot of people who engage in self-harm, they do it to avoid acting on suicidal thoughts or to avoid having suicidal thoughts. But not only are you not asking about suicidal thoughts when you use a euphemism, you're also conveying that you yourself may consider the topic to be unspeakable. And here you are, you've already got somebody who's scared that you're going to freak out. Highly technical term I learned in PhD school, that you might freak out. And so we need to be able to show that we can ask about it, we can talk about it without freaking out. So one way to ease into the question could be, you know, to hear what the person's going through, and then to say something like, a lot of people who describe feeling what you're feeling, a lot of people who have depression, or a lot of people who feel hopeless, also have thoughts of suicide. Do you think of suicide? And in asking that way, we've normalized that many people do think of suicide. I don't think we should normalize suicide itself. I don't think that would be productive, constructive, or accurate, because in this country, it's something like 14 out of 100,000 people die by suicide, and that's not normal, quote, quote, in terms of normal being common or frequent. But 15 million adults and adolescents report every year that they have serious thoughts of suicide. That is not abnormal. Well, I don't know, some people might say 15 million out of however many million people in this country. But it's not nearly as uncommon as people tend to think. And many people who have suicidal thoughts feel like they're the only one, and that you've never encountered somebody who's this, quote, quote, bad off. And so if we can ask in a way that shows that we do know that people, you know, have suicidal thoughts, that we are okay to talk about it, that's great. Very often, somebody will say no when the answer is yes. And those are the situations that scare me. So over the years, what I've recognized is that I need to ask when somebody says no, they don't have suicidal thoughts. I need to ask if in the future you did have suicidal thoughts. Do you think you could tell me? And you'd be surprised at how many people say no. Or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, because y'all all know that people are fearing hospitalization. What surprises me is that they're so honest about it. And they say, no, I wouldn't tell you. And now this opens the door for us to discuss why. What would make it hard for you to tell me? And this is where they say you would call 911, or you would have me committed to a hospital, or you won't work with me if I have suicidal thoughts, because there are therapists who will not work with people who have suicidal thoughts, much to my chagrin. And so now that they've said that, I can explain what my line is for when I would call to involve other people. I'm quite conservative when it comes to involving other people and recommending or even pursuing hospitalization. I know not everyone is as conservative, so please don't take this as prescriptive. But I will not call against somebody's will to involve other people unless they appear to be truly at imminent risk for suicide. I consider it to be an absolute last resort to force care on somebody at a higher level than they are seeking, for what are probably obvious reasons, and especially because the police can get involved and often do. And so I say, I wouldn't do anything without your consent unless, like, you were on the verge of killing yourself. Like if you said, Stacy, I've got a firearm in my car, I just wanted to say goodbye. And after this, I'm going to go and I'm going to drive to a park and kill myself. Then I would, of course, talk with the person, or, I'm saying to the client, I would, of course, talk with you, but if you persist and that's your plan, then I will have to involve somebody else. And 99 times out of 100, well, this is if somebody has suicidal thoughts, they say, well, I'm not that serious about suicide, or my suicidal thoughts aren't that intense. And now we're talking about the fact that they do have suicidal thoughts, even though just 2 minutes ago they said they didn't. So we do want to ask the standard questions, well, let me back up a little. There are standard questions about suicidal thoughts, and it can sound like an interrogation if you just ask those questions. Do you have thoughts of suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have means? Do you have access to means? Do you have intent? When would you carry out your plan? Have you made a suicide attempt? I mean, question, question, question. And I haven't met anybody who has said, I'm feeling really suicidal, and I know I would feel hope if you asked me a bunch of yes-no questions. And I would really feel hope if you asked me a bunch of yes-no questions that I realize you're asking to meet your own needs for information and not my needs to be heard and to try to connect and feel better. I know many people work in settings where you have to use the Columbia or some other standardized questionnaire, and I really encourage people, before you jump into all those questions, after somebody has said that they have suicidal thoughts, of course, to respond empathically and all that, about how hard it must be, or they must be going through something that is causing them to feel very hopeless or desperate to make them want to die by suicide. But I think it's also important, and this isn't my idea actually, this is from some therapists who developed something called the narrative approach to suicide risk assessment. It's also important to invite the person to tell their story. It can feel very minimizing and discounting if somebody says, I have suicidal thoughts, and the very first question is, do you have a plan? And often the person doesn't have a plan, and the therapist is like, phew, that's good, I'm really glad you don't have a plan. And then they move on as if there's not a problem. But thinking of suicide is by itself evidence that there's a problem, that there's pain or something outside of the person's control, numbness, whatever the situation is. And so I encourage people to use the narrative approach and to say something along the lines of, can you tell me the story of what's happened to make you think of suicide? Or can you tell me the story of what's going on? Or even something as simple as, what's going on? or tell me more. I mean, there's research that if you say tell me and you say story in the same line, then people are more forthcoming. But I also don't think it needs to be a specific script that is followed word by word. So after we've asked, we've invited the person to tell us their story, often in the telling of the story, many of our questions are answered. Often the person will disclose when they first started thinking of suicide, whether they've made an attempt, and we'll get to hear more. But then we do have needs in terms of the information we need to be able to take stock of the situation. And so then we do need to ask the questions that they don't answer, such as plan, timing, intent, means, access to means, other forms of self-harm. And then we've done this. We've invited the person to tell their story. And by the way, I left off that we also listen as they tell their story and explore more and invite them to say more rather than shut down the conversation. And then we get the information that we need. And then we can ask hope-based assessment questions as well. And so one of those could be, how did you get through it in your most recent the most recent time you had suicidal thoughts? What helped you to make it to the next morning? I don't know if y'all know there's a song called 5 More Minutes. And if you hear it, it's a very upbeat song. It sounds, like something to dance to. But the duo, War and Treaty, who sing it, they did a music video, and it's very clearly, despite the upbeat tone, an anti-suicide song, because they show a man who looks very despondent, and it says on the screen something like, stay 5 more minutes, stay 5 more minutes, your life is worth it. And so what helped you to make it through 5 more minutes, and then 5 more minutes after that? What about the time you felt most suicidal? Not just the most recent, but what was the worst episode that you went through? And how did you get through that? And what's kept you alive so far? What keeps you going? And these kinds of questions can help somebody to tap into their own hope. One of the things that I think is important is that we try to elicit hope as much as possible without imposing hope. If the person that we're working with can tap into it themselves, it will have a lot more power than us telling them there's hope. Now, sometimes there are contexts and situations where we may need to be very explicit and convey our hope very directly. But for the most part, really like anything, helping the person get there themselves is quite powerful. So then we've assessed suicidality. Let's say that they do have suicidal thoughts, they're not at imminent risk, and now what? And quite frankly, I find the cases where there's no suicidal thoughts or where there's imminent risk are very clear-cut. And the ones that are the harder ones for me are the in-betweens. Especially the people who do have suicidal thoughts with some intent, no explicit plan or they may have a plan for how they'll do it when the time comes, but they don't have a plan to do it now or tomorrow or the next day, and therefore they don't meet criteria for hospitalization. Hospitalization could be quite harmful if they're not in the place where they feel they need it and they're not at imminent risk. And by hospitalization, I also mean just sending them to an emergency room, which can present its own problems. And so they are going to leave the office. And it can be very easy to get swept up in fears of, oh no, are they okay? And oh no, what if they get a bad phone call in between now and the next appointment? And so that's where safety planning comes in. And the research shows there's still a significant portion of people who use contracts where you ask the person to promise not to act on their suicidal thoughts, and those don't work. And not only do they not work, they can hurt. Because in qualitative interviews, people have said, when a therapist asks me to promise not to act on my suicidal thoughts, first of all, if only it were that easy, then they wouldn't be getting help. But second of all, I feel like, this is what they say in qualitative interviews, I feel like it's CYA for the therapist. Oh, sorry. I am being video recorded, and I think this will play again, but I will go ahead and say it's cover your ass. Cover yourself liability-wise. And so then the client often, I mean, again, we can't generalize for everybody. I've certainly met people who said what kept me going was my therapist made me promise and I didn't want to break the promise. But in the larger scale, there's enough evidence to show that people do continue to move on and attempt suicide or die by suicide even after making this promise, and that we can't rely on it. So in the days when almost everybody used contracts, it was, can you make this promise to me that you won't act on suicidal thoughts without calling me or going to an emergency room? And what that meant is that we weren't helping the person to get through the crisis. We were asking them to get help from somebody else. Of course, there are going to be times when they do need to get help from somebody else. But the value of safety planning is that we're helping them plan in advance what they can do. And we're helping them to develop coping skills to get themselves through the crisis. And the safety plan generally starts with asking people to identify the triggers or warning signs that suicidal thoughts may be developing or worsening or danger may be increasing. And then what are things they can do to distract themselves? And what are places they can go to for distraction? Who are people they can be with for distraction? And then who are people they can ask for help? Because sometimes the people they'll go to for distraction aren't people they want to confide in that they have suicidal thoughts. But are there family or friends that they can go to for help? And then are there professionals? So you see these are kind of like concentric circles, starting with oneself and then branching out a little further, a little further. And professionals and settings could include calling a hotline, going to an emergency room if they are having urges that they feel that they're not able to control, or if they think they do need a higher level of care. And of course, I tell my clients, if you need to skip the first few steps, that's okay. And I also tell my clients the safety plan is iterative and it's an ongoing experiment, so that if somebody does act on suicidal thoughts and survives and comes back, that they're not scared to tell me. Because if it's conveyed as, again, a contract or a promise, then there may be shame, and they don't want to let you know that they, quote, failed. And so what I say is, if something happens and this doesn't work, the plan failed. You didn't fail. And that seems to help some people. The other therapeutic value of the safety plan is, for some people, it can help them realize they do have more options than they recognized, and that they have had tunnel vision. And it can create a goal for people who, some of my students will say to me, well, what if they don't have people they can ask for help? Won't that make them feel bad? Well, they already feel bad about not having people they can ask for help. It won't be news for that to come up with us. But what we can do is say, well, this is a goal then. This isn't just a plan. This is also a goal if you'd like for it to be. You know, do you want to have people you can go to for help? And then it can give them the confidence of having a plan. You saw before I quoted Barack Obama. Well, now I will quote John Kennedy, who said, at least this is what the internet says he said, which means it could have been Abraham Lincoln or it could have been my mother, I'm not sure. But John Kennedy said the best time to fix a leaky roof is when it's not raining. So planning for safety when the person's not in danger is the best time to plan for safety. I see there's a hand up in the back. Alicia, would you be able to take the microphone? Not all the way in the back, but like in the middle back on the left, my left.
Can you, apparently the email link, has error messages and isn't working, the one.
The web link.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very sad to say this, but the two people who developed the safety plan that's on this screen are named Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown. I'm not sad to say that, but I'm very sad to say that Barbara Stanley died about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago of ovarian cancer. My timing is so off, it may have been a month ago, I'm not sure, but, and I think that's why the website is down. So I think that her team may have been keeping it up, and so I need to contact them and make sure, I'll contact Dr. Brown and make sure that he knows.
Well, one of the things I wanted to say was the fact that Barbara did die. The other thing is I wanted people to know that there's a safety planning app that they also created that makes this so easy. And for some of us, it takes us away from the paper. And the app also does something that's really wonderful in that everything you said about making it theirs, right? Their plan, their ideas. And it also, when they put in the names of people they can contact, they put in the phone number, and all they have to do is touch it, it dials the number. And it also puts in the professional settings to call and gives them psychoeducation as well. And they did all this. They were amazing and so sad. Safety Planning app. It's in the App Store. It's in both of them. It has a blue background, I believe, and a white cross is what it looks like. Yes, Suicide Safety Plan.
Thank you very much, and that is an excellent resource, because I don't know if you've noticed, but there are people who are kind of attached to their phones. Of course, not me, no. And attached is putting it mildly. And so then they have the safety plan with them at all times. And other people don't need to be in their business. They don't know what the person's looking at. And so it is very useful. And I've also sometimes had clients where I ask them to enter the number of the national, well, it used to be the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Now it's the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And I would ask them to enter that number in their phone, like under a favorites. Now they've changed the number to 988, so people don't really need to remember. It used to be 800-273-8255. 988's a lot easier to remember. So I felt like I needed to give some attention to safety and survival, because that is important, of course. But I'm going to give you the assertion that safety and survival aren't enough. They might be enough for us from a liability standpoint, because we don't want the person to die in terms of our own fears. And not only a liability standpoint, but personal. We care about the people that we work with, and we don't want them to die. And so safety and survival, of course, are priorities, but they're not enough. We also need to help people feel better. We need to help them find hope, feel relief, and create a life worth living. And I have a website, I think Alicia mentioned, called speakingofsuicide.com. And it's intended for anybody who's touched by suicide in any way, You know, they have suicidal thoughts, they've lost somebody to suicide, they have a family or friend who has suicidal thoughts, they're curious about suicide. And I get a lot of really angry emails and comments in my comments section. And I had no idea until I started this site how many people hate suicide prevention. Did y'all know that? It was counterintuitive to me. I thought like suicide was one of those things that everybody wanted to reduce, kind of like cancer, you know, or COVID. Well, never mind, that's a whole other topic. But no, what they say to me is, you just want to save people for your own ego or your own professional safety, and you don't care that I'm miserable. And that's a sobering thing to hear. And it's a cognitive distortion. It's dichotomous thinking, because both can be true. You can care for reasons that have to do with your own needs and your own just human instinct to help somebody stay alive, and you can want them to feel better. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing you care about. But it is the only thing that many articles and books stress. You know, you can find a lot of books on suicide risk assessment. Safety planning is included in almost every standard training, but often that's where it stops. And I don't know if y'all know this, but the phrase risk management, I thought at one time was to manage the risk for suicide. So to try to navigate this kind of treacherous area where somebody's in danger of ending their life. But risk management is actually an insurance term. And it means to manage the risk of a lawsuit. At least originally. I mean, obviously there are other clinicians who, like me, were under the impression that it was managing risk of suicide. But we do also need to help alleviate people's suffering, to help instill hope. And because so many trainings do cover risk assessment and safety planning, this one doesn't go on any more about that. And now I'm going to focus on what we can do to help somebody stay alive, to help them feel less pain, to find value in life, and to, as Marsha Linehan put it, Marsha Linehan, who developed dialectical behavior therapy, to build a life worth living. And this is our cat Zelda. And she had been locked in a bathroom for about her first 3 weeks with us because she had tapeworm, which is lovely. And this was her first, 10 minutes out of the room. So I felt like this was a good metaphor. So something we can do to help people tap into their own hope is to ask them, what's their most important reason for staying alive? And this used to be a question on the Stanley Brown Safety Plan. It was the last question. And they took it off for some reason. And if you use the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality by Dave Jobs, CAMS, it is a question on his crisis response plan, which is just a different term for safety plan. But for many people, for them to invoke their main reason for staying alive when they're in a crisis can sustain them. And then to explore what are other reasons. You know, what's your most important reason? What are other reasons? Obviously, we want to get as many reasons as possible. When I wrote the first draft of my book, Helping the Suicidal Person, I talked about trying to take the option of suicide off the table for clients that we work with. And somebody who read the draft said, we're not really trying to take the option off the table. Actually, a lot of people are. But that can be that can create a gulf between us and the client if we're trying to take suicide off the table, and it's very much on the table for them. And what this psychologist said to me is, what we want to do is help people put so many other things on the table that they can't even see suicide anymore. And so that's where helping people connect with their different reasons for living can help them fill that table. And it's good to get as specific as possible. If they say family, what family? Which family members? What are their names? What are their relationships? And Craig Bryan, who's a psychologist, gives a story in one of his writings that he had a veteran who said, because Craig Bryan works with the military, the veteran said, my reasons for living are God and family. But when I'm in that state of mind, I can't see that. And it's hard to see things that are abstract. So, here are two reasons, God and family, which of course are rather big reasons, but 2 is a small number. And so Dr. Bryan said that having only 2 reasons for living left the veteran feeling deficient and incompetent. So Dr. Bryan asked him to list every family member who motivated him to stay alive. And within 5 minutes, this list of 2 reasons to live had grown to 30. Now, I personally think it's important that we not say, think of your family. Don't kill yourself, think of how it would hurt your family. There are people who disagree. But I think it's best for the person to get there themselves. So I want to be clear when I'm talking about family as a reason for living. It usually comes up organically with clients. But if it doesn't, I don't impose that reason for a number of reasons. One is that for some people, their family is not a reason for living, and in fact, they have a lot of anger towards their family. And it may give them some satisfaction to think of how sorry people will be for the way they treated them if they end their life. But for another reason, this is actually from somebody, he said this when he was about 8 years old. I read it in an article. A mother was talking about how her son had thought of suicide almost all his life. And he said to her, you just want me to stay alive so you won't hurt. So why don't you care that I hurt? And it can give that message if we're invoking other people. We're saying stay alive for other people, which means you hurt so that they don't. Now, of course, that's rather simplistic, but that is how many people can receive it. Some people have difficulty coming up with reasons for staying alive. Hopelessness and tunnel vision almost always accompany suicidal thinking. It's like the sun being hidden behind gray clouds. The reasons for living may still be there way behind the clouds, but they can't see them. And in such cases, it can be useful to ask the person what were their reasons for living. What made life worth living before? And if you did feel better, what would be your reasons for living? And then again, somebody still may not be able to list reasons for living. And there, rather than try to persuade, we can step back and empathize with how hard that would be to not be able to come up with reasons for living. Now, what often happens is there's hope-based reasons for living. I want to see my kids grow up. I think things could get better. I know that everything, that my life will be different in 5 years. Those are hope-based reasons. But what's much more common in my experience is fear-based reasons. And fear-based reasons have to do with being afraid of how my mother would feel, being afraid of hell, being afraid of attempting suicide and suffering lifelong physical injuries, surviving and suffering lifelong physical injuries. And again, these aren't reasons that I would want to impose on somebody, but if they offer them, I run with it. Tell me more. Tell me more about what's frightening about that for you. Because then it's coming from them, and it can help sustain them. A useful tool is the Reasons for Living inventory. And I mean, you can use it, it's used as a research tool, and you can use it and score it and all of that. But what I think is useful about it is just the ideas that come up, or the ideas that were generated to develop this inventory. One of the things the researcher did, which was, again, Marsha Linehan and her team, is they went to the Capitol. I don't know why, the Capitol, like 2 miles away. And asked people randomly, what are your reasons for living? So that was one of the places. I think there was a shopping mall, too, where they asked such questions. And the same reasons kept coming up again and again. There were survival and coping beliefs, like thinking I can get through this. There was responsibility to family. There were child-related concerns, which for some reason is considered separately from responsibility to family. There was fear of suicide or fear of death, fear of social disapproval, and moral objections to suicide. Now, there's something missing on that makes me very suspicious about the validity of this questionnaire, and that's pets. I have so many clients who say to me, I don't want my cat or dog to be put in a shelter. And so asking the person what's their reasons for living, and then if they can't come up with any, it can be useful to give them that questionnaire, not on a research basis, not to score it, but just to see, do any of these reasons resonate with them? And again, without our imposing those reasons on them. If we get into a spot where we feel like we are trying to convince them of reasons to stay alive, that can really inspire a power struggle, where we're trying to convince them there are reasons to live, and they're trying to convince us there aren't. And power struggles are very hard to win. Any parent can tell you that. Any parent who raised a young child or an adolescent can tell you that. So again, starting where the client is important. So I clearly am not looking at the mirrors enough in the back of the room because I neglected to advance the slide to show you what these different domains are in the Reasons for Living inventory. And that scale is available for free through the address is on the slide. It's not an easy to remember address. And these are available as handouts, these slides are. So you don't need to rush and write it down because you've got options to look at it later. I do just want to say one other thing before I advance from this, and that's that some students and professionals in trainings have told me that they fear asking about reasons for living in case there aren't any. And what they've said to me is, I don't want to make them feel bad. And this is the same thing as what I said before, if they don't have people to call for help, they know they don't have reasons for living. I did a research study a few years ago where I was interviewing people at a psychiatric emergency room in Denver, and we had to give a spiel for informed consent before we started the interview, and we had to tell them what the risks were, and one of the risks required by the Institutional Review Board at my university was that these questions might be upsetting, and you might feel bad. And somebody said to me, there is nothing you can say to me that would make me feel worse than I already feel. And that's important in this context, that if somebody doesn't have reasons for living, we're not making them aware of that. There's 168 hours in a week. They may spend 50 minutes to an hour with us on average. I mean, I know some people see people more frequently, but during those other 167 hours when they're not sleeping, They're quite aware. So it's important to ask the question, even if we're afraid of the answer. So I mentioned before tunnel vision, and the technical term for tunnel vision is cognitive constriction. And Ed Schneidman, who is considered the father of modern suicidology, he said the single most dangerous word in all of suicidology is the four-letter word only. And this is important because people, when they are in a state of mind where they have suicidal thoughts, it's like a horse wearing those things on each side of its eye, and then they can't see everything around them, which I don't think is very kind to horses, but for some reason, that's what's done with like the horses in Central Park. And so then the person who is wearing these blinders can't see what's in their midst. And they may have options and reasons for living that are outside their vision. And one way to think about this is that the pain or despair or dissociation or whatever it is that the person's experiencing that's fueling their suicidal thoughts can be thought of as a mental toothache. Anybody here had like an abscessed tooth before? You can't think of anything else. I had an abscessed tooth, true story. And here's this tiny, tiny little piece of your body. It's, it's like as big as my pinky fingernail, or at least, maybe not as thick. It's much thicker. And that's all you can think of. And so somebody who's in suicidal despair, that can be, depending on their level of, depending on the intensity of their suicidal thoughts, that may be all that they are thinking about. And so Dr. Schneidman said that the suicidal person's thinking pattern has constricted. Often it's dichotomous with only two possibilities, yes or no. Life as I want it and cannot have it, or death. The ideal life, or I can't live at all. And there are various ways to address cognitive constriction, and I'm going to go over these different ways. One is the unfinished business list. Oops, I advanced too far. The unfinished business list, the psychologists who wrote about this, Thomas Ellis and Corey Newman, they said it's a way to help people procrastinate suicide. Usually procrastination's a bad thing, but when it comes to suicide, procrastination is great. And if they can come up with different things they want to do before they die, even if it's in the service of suicide, like, some people, they'll say, well, I can't kill myself until I've changed my will, gotten my life insurance policy updated, and cleaned out the house. It's amazing how many people cleaning out the house is important to them. And I tell you what, if I were in a very actively suicidal state and I had to clean out my house first, that would buy me about 20 years. Especially my basement. So we can ask people, what's on your unfinished business? What are the things that you want or need to do? And this can cover many different categories, and we can ask them for the different categories. For adolescents, it can be very useful to ask, what are the things you want to do as an adult? What are the things you want to do when you move out of your parents' house? We can ask about romance, travel, where are places that you want to go, work, fitness, languages to learn. You can ask people to think of their future selves. Invite them to visualize different selves that they might become in the years to come. 1 year from now, 5 years, 10 years. Now let me say, I know that for somebody who's in a suicidal state of mind, these questions can be very daunting when you start talking in years. Because it's like, I don't know how to get through the next few days, and you're asking me to think of the next few years. And so we can acknowledge that and explore that with the person, and also ask them to try to envision possible future selves, where they might want to live, what work they might want to do, what tattoos they might want to get. Very generational. In my generation, nobody got tattoos, but now I think I read recently that the majority of people under 30, who are adults, have tattoos, which, great. Which ones do you want to get? Because it can take like 6 months to finish a very ornate tattoo. So even if the person's can't see their problem changing. I mean, some people have irrevocable problems. A child died, or they have an illness that is irreversible. The experience of suffering can change. And I know that's not very uplifting to say, you can keep hurting, but you'll hurt differently. But people's experiences change. People's they can find different meanings and different meaning in experiences. And one of the things that is really powerful is that the only constant in life is change. And so what are some ways things might change? I'm not saying things will change or could change, or, I personally don't think it gets better is a good thing to say to somebody, because some people cannot imagine that it gets better. But it does get different. And so what are some ways that you could see change happening? And again, even when, and this may or may not be something depending on the context that you would actually want to say to a client, but there are many people for whom even when their experience of suffering doesn't change, they develop spirituality, or they develop a practice of mindfulness, or they mobilize for larger causes and make meaning from their situation in other ways. I think it was Nietzsche who said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And so finding what that why is can be something to put on your unfinished business list. And the goal of this exercise isn't only to inspire hope, it's also just to get people thinking about what might be out of their vision. Reasons for living and other positive beliefs and memories can become unavailable when one is depressed and suicidal. And this is something borne out by research, that autobiographical memory is much more general when someone is in a suicidal state of mind. And so this leads me to the Hope Kit, which was first articulated as part of cognitive therapy for suicide prevention. And the Hope Kit is a collection of things that somebody might put together as reminders for living. What some of those things are on their unfinished business list. A picture of a dog they want to get one day, preferably from an animal shelter. Pictures of places they want to go. Letters from people. Well, I'm showing my age here. First of all, I already did by saying tattoos weren't the thing when I was younger. But second of all, there used to be this thing, I don't know if y'all remember it, it was called mail. And it would come in an envelope, and it might have a card in it. And so if anyone does receive one of these historical artifacts, they could put that in their Hope Kit if it's something that gives them a feeling of hope or warmth or love. The Hope Kit can be symbols of the past, symbols of the future. And there's also an app. There's multiple apps for the Hope Kit. So if you go to your app store and just enter Hope Kit or Hope Box, then you'll get different ones for that. And what these different ways of helping to broaden somebody's thinking point to is that for many people, suicide is a problem-solving behavior. You know, I don't know if you've heard this phrase before, that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, which apparently was first said on the Phil Donahue show. Showing my age again. And people in the suicide prevention field, they don't like that phrase because they say, no, suicide is not a solution. We shouldn't be saying it's a solution. People with suicidal thoughts don't like that phrase because they say, you're saying my problems are temporary and I don't think they are and you're invalidating me. But I'm going to speak to the solution part. The reality is that for somebody who is in a situation they feel they can't bear anymore, suicide is a solution. And we need to accept that and explore that rather than deny it. And what we can do to help get to this, get to the bottom of somebody viewing suicide as a solution, is to ask them, what problems would killing yourself solve? And very often people immediately have an answer. They're quite aware. And then would you still want to die if you could solve those problems in some other way? Duh, yeah, of course I would. I want to kill myself because I can't solve the problems, so if I could, I wouldn't want to kill myself. Well, could we work together to see what other ways there may be to solve your problems? And this can be very powerful for some people. Not everybody, but it's well documented. Just like people with suicidal thoughts often have poor or overgeneral autobiographical memory, it's well documented that they also have poor problem-solving skills. And so if we can help them to view their situation as a problem that may be solvable, not necessarily in the way that they're thinking. Again, there are problems people have that are irrevocable. Not everybody, but some. Like if a child dies, you don't say to the person, you're going to feel better. Their child is not going to come back to life. And people who have suicidal thoughts often view their problems as inescapable, interminable, and intolerable. And that's what can lead to feelings of hopelessness. So providing concrete skills and problem solving, or not really providing, but helping the person tap into problem solving skills, helping them see other ways, either to solve the problem or to solve the problem about the problem. You know, if the problem isn't changeable, are there different ways to cope with it? Are there different things that can be done to adapt or integrate this problem in a way that doesn't require them to die? So the people who wrote about suicide as problem solving and who proposed these questions are Childs and Strozal. I think it's John Childs and Kirk Strozal, I'm not sure. And they give the example of a patient who says, or a client who says, I guess suicide is my last resort, and I'm getting to the point now of needing my last resort. And the therapist says, before you get to that point, would it make sense for us to work together to explore what you've done so far to try to solve the problem and see if we can come up with something that might work better and doesn't involve you having to be dead? They also caution, though, that this approach can be invalidating and unempathic if we use it too soon. If we haven't heard the person's story, if we haven't listened empathically and bravely to the pain that they're conveying, it can sound sort of like, don't worry, be happy. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And I'm going to talk about just one more way that we could help ease cognitive constriction, and then I'm going to see if there are any questions, because I also need to refill my glass of water. And that is, actually, I'm going to talk about 1.5 more ways. Helping somebody generate an options list. Helping someone come up with every single possible solution to what they're experiencing, even if it's a terrible idea. Because that's the first rule of brainstorming, right? Bad ideas are still ideas, or there's no such thing as bad ideas. And actually, there probably are bad ideas. But in this context, what we're trying to do is help people expand their thinking and to recognize that the options aren't just ideal life or death, that there are degrees, that there are gradations on the continuum. And so the more ideas, the better, and not judging. And what this is, this options list, is part of the problem-solving method. And of course, the problem-solving method, you identify the problem, you brainstorm possible solutions, and that's the options list. And then asking the person to rank order what the possibilities are to pursue next. And then to frame it as an experiment. Try this option, and if that doesn't work, we'll move on to the next. But how about you collect some data between now and the next session to see how that works. So let me just disappear for a moment and find my water. And is Alicia here? I see her. Are there, so I see, I'm sorry, Alicia, I didn't mean to make you run. There's a question over here, just like directly in front of me. Yes, please, because we have people online who need to be able to hear.
So who is the person?
Right.
Something that comes to my mind during these conversations sometimes, and I'm never sure if it's a horrible idea or a good one, is to get a little philosophical and acknowledge our mortality. And maybe it's horrible, right, as I'm saying it, but kind of to say something like, or to acknowledge that we are mortal, that we will die at some point, and this is our chance to enjoy the sun, taste food, things that we're just going to lose when we die, and we all will die at some point. I can never tell if maybe it's a case by case, but is that something useful, meaningful, or is it getting into territory that's too dark? I don't know, but I want to throw it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think it's going to depend on the person, but I mean, that's an existential issue. We are all going to die. And to talk about that can be freeing for somebody who isn't able to talk about it with other people who instinctively shut down the conversation. I have a colleague whose son is a teenager, and he had to have open heart surgery. I'm sorry, he didn't have to have open heart surgery, he had to have a heart transplant. And it was his second heart transplant, and he's about 14 years old. His first was just like his second or third day of life, and then that heart failed. And he said to my friend, he said, I'm scared I'm going to die. And she said, you are, but not today. Now, I realize this is a different context. This was somebody who doesn't want to die. But what it makes me think of is a client shared with me once, and I generally don't like talking about clients publicly, but this is just such a general situation. There's no way that you could possibly know anything about them. But they said to me once that the most helpful thing I said to them, and this was somebody who had chronic suicidal thoughts for years, the most helpful thing I said to them was that they were debating, and this is going to sound weird, but this is how the suicidal mind can be. do I do X, which could be taking a new job, going on a trip, getting married, whatever, or do I kill myself? And I had said what might have seemed glibly, well, why don't you just do X, and if it doesn't work out, then you can kill yourself. And they said this was the most valuable thing I had said to them. Validating and also helping them break that dichotomous thinking. Alicia, there's another question directly in front of me. Actually, there's like 4, but...
Sure, and then could we go to a virtual question too?
Sure.
How do you respond to suicidal clients who really feel when they think about family that they will actually be loving and caring for their family by removing themselves from the equation? They feel their family's better off.
That is such a good question. How do you address it when a client says, I'm a burden, and my family will be better off without me? And again, I want to try the best I can to elicit their own rebuttal to that, rather than my rebutting it. But if I am rebutting it, or if the context lends itself to that, what I try to convey is that whatever burden your problems impose now, the burden may, not only may, but usually, almost always, is much worse if the person dies. Now, I want to be careful because I don't want to guilt somebody. I don't know, are any of you on Twitter? Will you raise your hand if you're on Twitter? Okay, my sympathies. I'm on Twitter too, and I wish I had never gotten on. But there's a psychiatrist on Twitter named Alan Francis. And he tweeted one day that he uses guilt as a suicide prevention measure, that if somebody says they want to kill themselves, he tells them how, you're going to make everyone who loves you carry this wound for the rest of their life and feel terrible. And, I think there were like 1,000 retweets saying how awful that was. And I was one of them. Because I think, when somebody has suicidal thoughts, they already feel guilty. They already feel bad. They may, the common denominator in almost all my clients with suicidal thoughts is self-hate. And so to tell them you're going to make everybody feel bad can make them hate themselves more. How could I think of doing that to them? My parents have been so loving. They've given me so much. How could I think of hurting them like that? So I want to be very careful about conveying the consequences of suicide. But one thing that can be helpful is to pose it as a question. Do you think that whatever burden your illness or situation may impose now would be less than or more than if you die? Now, they may say, well, it'll be a bigger burden when I die at first, but they'll get over it, and that's finite. That's temporary. And it can be useful to explore that more with them. Do you know somebody who's lost somebody to suicide? What's it been like for them? I have a colleague at the University of Denver whose mother died by suicide when he was 5 years old, and he's older than I am and still hasn't gotten over it. I'm telling y'all this. I'm not saying I would say that to a client. The other thing that I wanted to say about that, I knew I was going to forget my thought. Is what would you say, and this is, a common question in cognitive therapy, but what would you say to someone you care about who has that thought or belief? Who's someone you care about, like if they have a child or a niece or a nephew, what's their name? It's Mary. Okay, so what if Mary came to you and said, you'll be better off if I kill myself? What would you say? Or if she said, my parents, say she's not your own child, my parents would be better off, what would you say to them? And almost always, in fact, in my experience, always, my clients have never said they would tell the person to kill themselves. You know, there's the biblical thing, do unto others as they would do unto you, or something like that. I don't know, I'm not very biblical. But I think really the trick is to do unto yourself as you would do to others in many cases. Because people have a lot more compassion for other people than they do for themselves. So Alicia has some questions online.
So maybe I can do 2 online, and then we can go back to a couple in the audience. So this first one is saying, what do you do when folks refuse to engage in safety planning with you after sharing that they experience suicidal thoughts?
That's a good question. I have had quite a few clients who do not want to complete the form, but they will have a conversation. And so that's fine. I mean, completing the form is ideal because it's a plan that they can turn to when they're in a state of mind when they might not be able to think of specific options. But even just getting them thinking about things they can do can be useful. And so generally the objection has been to filling out the form. But some people, they don't even want to think about it at all. You know, they consider it to be a rote exercise, especially somebody with chronic suicidal thoughts who's already done like 17 safety plans. And I acknowledge that and accept that. Again, I don't want to get into a power struggle, and then I document that they didn't want to engage in safety planning so that it's clear that I tried. It wasn't my omission, but they made the choice to not engage in safety planning.
The next question is, how would you address someone who would like to have assisted suicide after a medical issue, like cancer, for example?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't like that question. I'm kidding. I don't like that question because we get into this whole, I mean, I don't dislike the question, but I mean, I'm kidding about not liking that question because we get into a whole other territory when we get to physician-assisted suicide. Such a different territory that, did you know this? That when somebody dies by physician-assisted suicide, it's not classified as suicide on their death certificate. It's classified as whatever underlying illness they had that led them to end their life. So you'll see more and more the phrase physician-assisted death because there are people who say we shouldn't be calling it suicide. Now, frankly, my belief is that we're perpetuating stigma and bias by not calling it suicide because it is suicide. Somebody is ending their life in an unnatural way. And if it really were their illness that was the cause of death, then they would live until the illness ended their life. So it is suicide. But I think it presents completely different issues when it comes to prevention. Generally, if somebody has a healthy body and their suicidal thoughts seem to originate from unhealthy thinking, then we want to prevent their suicide. But if somebody's body is in the process already of dying and they're thinking rationally and want to end their life as a way to avoid either physical degeneration or a painful death, then do we need to prevent that? Do we want to prevent that? And the American Association of Suicidology says no. That's pretty big. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I think, has a different philosophy, but the American Association of Suicidology issued a statement several years ago saying this does not fall under the purview of suicide prevention. Now, what you get into then are legal problems because physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted death, also sometimes called death with dignity, is legal in, I think it's now 13 or 14 states plus District of Columbia. It's legal in my state, in Colorado. So it's pretty clear cut what I can do. I can refer somebody to a physician for, to evaluate, whether they qualify. But if you live in a state where it's not legal, it's much murkier, and I recommend calling your malpractice insurance company and asking for a free consultation with an attorney about how to proceed. There was one more online question, wasn't there?
Can you talk about inspiring hope for suicidal clients in the group therapy setting?
Oh yeah, that can be hard because there can be contagion. But often, again, what people say to somebody else is very different from what they say to themselves. And there's therapeutic value in asking clients, what would you say to so-and-so who's saying there's no hope? If they say, yes, I agree, there's no hope, then ask somebody else. And if they also say, I agree, there's no hope, then, it could be useful to say, well, I'm going to have to disagree. And I think even if you think there's no hope, I'd like to ask you, what might someone who does think there's hope, what might they think of? And what might they say? But what can be really valuable is that sometimes in the group therapy setting, somebody hears themselves saying something to someone that they wish would be said to them. And they're like, oh my God, I need to follow this advice. And so it can be therapeutic in that way.
Hi, I'm thinking of a couple of signs that a therapist could possibly miss. And one is that a possible side effect of some antidepressants is suicidal ideation. And another thing is sometimes before somebody successfully kills themselves, suddenly their affect changes and they're feeling better and they have a sense of peace. And the clinician might misinterpret it and think, okay, they're fine now, when actually they're really at imminent risk.
Yes, absolutely. So one thing that might happen is that people feel better because they've made the decision to die by suicide. And another thing that might happen is that antidepressants could trigger suicidal thoughts. So let me talk to each of those separately. I don't know if y'all saw in the exhibit hall, and if you're responsible for this and you're in this audience, I apologize in advance. But there's an exhibit about medication-induced suicide prevention. And I stood there for about 3 minutes trying to figure out, are they trying to prevent medication-induced suicide, or is the suicide prevention medication-induced? Two very different things. In one case, medication is preventing suicide, and in the other case, it's contributing, and guess what? That's what they were talking about. Preventing medication-induced suicide. And I'm not sure what the most recent statistics are on this, but a little while back, the most recent ones were that about 3 to 5% of people experience suicidal urges after starting antidepressants. And that, based on statistical testing, it can be ascertained that this was triggered by the antidepressants. And so I think it's important to be vigilant and to warn the person that that either they could develop suicidal thoughts or their suicidal thoughts could worsen, and that it could be a side effect of the medication, which actually can give some people hope, because then they're like, oh, there's something I can do about it. But I'm not a physician, so what I'm about to say, there may not be the physiology for this, but my own thought is that whatever a psychiatric drug can do, it can also do its opposite. So this is why you'll see that antidepressants can cause weight gain or weight loss. They can cause insomnia or hypersomnia. And so if antidepressants can affect the brain in such a way that it can relieve suicidal thoughts for some people, then it makes sense that for some people it may have the opposite effect. And education and preparation is key. As for the other issue of people feeling better because they've made the decision to die by suicide, this is why I always want to explore why people are feeling better. I don't want to take it for granted. There's a lot of people, a lot of clinicians, and this is just a human instinct, that when somebody says they feel better, the clinician says, good. Good, I'm so glad to hear that. And you are, right? But what if they're not really feeling better and you've said good? Now they hear that you would be disappointed if they weren't feeling better. And similarly, if we say good and the reason for feeling better is that they've decided to resolve their problems by ending their life, then we've shut a door. You know, so a better response, if you really just have the overwhelming urge to say good, then what I encourage is to say that's really good for us to know, or that's really good for me to know. And what's better? You know, what's changed? What's helped you to get to this place? And the reality is, and I'm very sorry to have to say this, but the reality is some people will hide that they're going to die by suicide, no matter our best intentions and our best questions. But there are also some people where you'll be able to hear where there's ambivalence and where there's not, where there's specificity and depth to their reasons for feeling better and where there's not. And you'll be able to explore that. So the most that you can, explore that. I just want to tell y'all, I love that you have questions. I do have a little more of the presentation, so.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering how you adapt this, and if you adapt this for persons with autism who may have greater challenges with connection, emotion, tunnel vision. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I will just say I do not specialize in treating people with autism, so I do not know. I would think that, you know, a lot of people with autism are much more concrete thinkers. And so things like the problem-solving method may actually appeal to them because it's got specific steps. But there's a lot we don't know about. We do know that suicidality, the risk is higher among people with autism. Really, anything in the DSM just about. Dementia and intellectual developmental disabilities are the only conditions for which suicide risk isn't higher. So we do know that the risk for suicide and suicidality is higher, and there's still a lot we're looking at to how to address that for people with autism and for other intellectual or cognitive disabilities. So one more and then I'll resume. I'm going to drink a whole glass of water during these questions.
I see a lot of patients with borderline and also patients that tend to label themselves as chronically ill. And I'm just wondering, how do you go about, you know, safety with them and, you know, empowering them to identify, you know, those life worth living reasons, because it's much harder for someone with BPD, in my opinion, to achieve that.
Yeah, people who have borderline personality disorder or really any chronic suicidality can present tremendous challenges in terms of, I mean, there's sort of this image of a suicidal crisis that's conveyed that somebody has suicidal thoughts, they ask for help, they get help, they're better. And I wish it were true. For some people, it is true, and it's really amazing when that happens. But for people who have chronic suicidal thoughts, and borderline personality disorder is the only illness in the DSM for which that's a symptom, chronic suicidal thoughts, that it's a constant. And it may not be a constant every day, but it constantly returns for many people. So with people who have chronic suicidal thoughts, I find that this problem-solving approach, not using the problem-solving method, but, and I think I have a slide on this later, but exploring with them what is the function of their suicidal thoughts can be really useful. Because for a couple reasons. One, if they can discern what the function is, and for many people, the function is emotion regulation. And that sounds paradoxical, that thinking of suicide would have a constructive purpose. But for many people, knowing that they can end their pain helps them to tolerate their pain. We talked before about assisted suicide. Well, when that first became legal in Oregon, they did studies and found that, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 1/3 of people who got a prescription for a lethal dose of medication didn't fill it, and 1/3 of people who filled it didn't use it. And they interviewed these people, and they said, just knowing I could helped me deal with pain. That if I didn't know, before I had this option, I was panicked. And I would sit there and think, how can I get through this? How can I get through this? So discerning the function of suicidal thoughts. For some people, it's that they're very angry at themselves. They hate themselves and they want to punish themselves. Well, now it makes the problem a much more manageable problem to target than just free-floating feelings of I want to be dead. There was something else I was going to say about that. Oh, that the other thing that's useful about it is that about helping someone, working with someone to discern the function, is that it can put them in the role of witness. And a big challenge and also a big point of entry for people with suicidal thoughts is that they're over-identified with their suicidal thoughts. If you use acceptance and commitment theory, this could be considered fusion or self as object instead of transcendent self. But it's like I want to kill myself, therefore I need to kill myself. Instead of, I want to kill myself, I wonder why. And getting to this place of curiosity where they can be trying, suicidal thoughts aren't an indictment or a sentence, they're a question. So one way to look at functions is a behavioral chain analysis, which is part of dialectical behavior therapy. And we often think of chain analysis, since it's called a behavioral chain analysis, we often think of it as something to do with behaviors. But thinking is a behavior. And so if we can do a chain analysis where we ask them to go through each link in the chain, like for example, this morning when you woke up to the point where you wanted to kill yourself, or the point where you got the pills out of the medicine cabinet, or whatever concrete thing, what were you, for each link of the chain, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? What did you do? And at each link, what was something you could have done differently, or what was the problem that you were solving in that moment by doing that? And that can be a way to get at functions. And another part of behavioral chain analysis is what was reinforced. What in behavioral parlance, what was the reward? And is there another way to get that? So if it helps you to regulate your emotions, if it helps to calm you down, to know that you can kill yourself, what's something else you can do to calm yourself down? So I'm getting ahead of myself because I actually do have a slide on behavioral chain analysis. So I will take this as my cue to finish the presentation and then with what time is left to take some additional questions. So something else we can do with clients is what's called broaden and build positive emotions. And the idea behind broadening and building positive emotions is that even the tiniest change, the tiniest shift in emotion or hope can generate more change. And the metaphor for this is an upward spiral. We all know about a downward spiral, but this is positive emotions beget more positive emotions. And there are 10 representative emotions that can create more positive momentum. And this is from the field of positive psychology. And these would include joy, gratitude, serenity, interest, hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, and awe. And of course, when someone is in a point of distress that's so grave that they think of suicide, positive emotions can be painfully hard to come by. And again, we don't want to be in a place where we're saying, don't worry, be happy. But we can think very, very small. So one question could be, if we could select a small task that if you accomplished it, would tell you that things were just a little better, what would it be? Well, I would eat a Milky Way. I mean, it can be as small as that. I would take a nap. You know, I would get the laundry done. I mean, often what people feel submerged by are things that are rather mundane. And so what's just one small thing that you could do and that could help generate this upward spiral? Something else that we can do is what's called a self-compassion break, because I mentioned that self-hate is very common in people with suicidal thoughts. Now, they may not call it that. I've had clients who are averse to that term. They'll say, I don't hate myself. Oh my God, that sounds terrible. I just am a total effing loser. Okay, you don't hate yourself. So the self-compassion break can be something that helps people to achieve distance, to observe themselves, and to feel compassion. And I have to say that when I teach, I often intersperse my slides with pictures of cats and dogs and horses and koala bears. And I call these brain breaks because it gives students a chance for their brain to just not be focusing on suicide for a moment. And I didn't feel like I could do that here because there's 200 people in the room and 200 people online, and it just didn't seem very professional. So, plus I think this might be aired later, as a continuing ed thing. And next time. So now I've made you feel deprived. I apologize.
You did put in a cat picture.
I did. I put in a cat picture before. And also you could go to Facebook. The Calico Sisters and Friends is my cat's Facebook page. So some delayed gratification for you. But what I'm doing here is I'm building in a different kind of brain break. And I'm going to walk you through the self-compassion break, and I encourage you to do it if you'd like to while I walk you through. And this is by Kristen Neff, who has written extensively on self-compassion. And if you want to close your eyes and don't feel dorky doing that, please feel free. But I'm going to ask you to call to mind a situation in your life that troubles you, but not too much. We only have a few minutes, but something that's stressing you out or causing you anxiety or creating emotional discomfort in some other way. And I want you to think of that situation and to feel whatever stress or discomfort in your body that comes when you think of that. And as you observe yourself having these feelings of distress or anxiety or pain or whatever, say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. You may not say it aloud, you may think it. But again, this is a moment of suffering. And maybe you want to change the language and say something else that affirms your experience, like, this really sucks, or I'm hurting. Whatever you say, stay present with your feelings without resistance or judgment. Now, for the second part of the self-compassion break, I'll ask you to say to yourself, suffering is a part of life. And I don't mean get over it, into everyone's life, a little rain must fall, it's no big deal. I don't mean anything like that. On the contrary, what I mean is suffering is big, and it affects everybody, and it connects you to other people. Suffering is part of being human. And so you could tell yourself whatever fits, but here are some ideas. You could tell yourself, I'm not alone. I hurt like other people. We're all doing the best we can. And if you feel comfortable, put your hands over your heart or touch yourself in some other way that feels loving, like putting your hand on your shoulder. Feel the warmth of your hands or hands on you. And as you're touching yourself, and if you don't want to touch yourself, then just say or think this to yourself, may I be kind to myself. There are other possibilities too. May I give myself compassion. May I accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. You could also think about what you most wish someone would say to you right now, and say that to yourself. Or you can think about what you would say to somebody you love, and say that to yourself. These are the steps of the self-compassion break. 3 steps. This is a moment of suffering. Suffering connects me to everybody else in this world. I am not alone. May I be kind to myself. And frankly, some self-disclosure here, I never get past this as a moment of suffering, because the moment I think that, it puts me in this mode of what some people call the compassionate witness. And I'm accepting what I'm feeling, and I'm not resisting it. So, I mean, I use the other steps, but not necessarily in the order that's prescribed, because it is just so powerful for me to just let myself feel what I'm feeling without judgment. If this doesn't work for you, if this didn't work for you now, I hope you'll try again, because, you don't go to the gym and do one workout and then you're in shape for the rest of your life, or that you're in shape immediately. It takes practice and repetition. And you can find that just by going on Google and doing self-compassion break, Kristen Neff, and you'll find it. But if you're not able to find it, feel free to email me. My email will be on the final slide. So I want to talk about some hope-building exercises, and these were tested in a psychiatric hospital for people who are being treated on an inpatient basis for suicidality. You may look at them and think, oh my God, these look trite and shallow, they couldn't possibly help, but guess what? All but one helped. The forgiveness letter did not help, and it made some people feel worse. The forgiveness letter, what some people reported was that it made them dwell on a way that they had been wounded, and therefore they spiraled, or they didn't want to forgive, which is everybody's right. I think that we, not we as therapists, but we as a society, preach forgiveness in a way that can be very invalidating and minimizing to people who they're not forgiving. I don't mean they're not forgiving people. I mean they're not forgiving the act. They're not forgiving the way they were hurt. Counting blessings isn't what it sounds like. It's not, oh, count how many good things you have in your life, because again, you might get punched in the mouth. But it is asking somebody, it is asking them about a positive experience that they had recently. Any positive experience. It doesn't matter how small. It could be petting a cat. And asking them to flesh it out. What did they like about it? What did they feel? What did they think? And if they say nothing positive has happened to me, I can't remember anything, then we can empathize with how hard it is and go further back in time or imagine what could be positive in the future. The best self is to ask somebody to imagine to imagine the best possible accomplishments they could have in the future. And then to ask them, what's one step that you may need to take, not right now, but in the future? Or what are multiple steps to begin or to begin again? The best possible self about relationships would be to imagine, again, the best possible relationship that they could have and what they could do to make that happen. Not immediately, but just at some point, what could they do? The gratitude letter is not list everything that you're grateful for, although there are definitely studies that find that that can be useful, especially like 3 things a day. Writing down what you're grateful for can not only improve mood, but also fend off the flu. Mind-body connection. It improves our immune system. But in this case, in this study, the gratitude letter was where a person recalls another person's kindness and writes a letter to that person that they may or may not send. With the forgiveness letter, they were told it won't be sent. But the gratitude letter, it's your choice, is what they're told. The important, enjoyable, and meaning activities is to ask somebody to complete 3 acts in a single day. One would be a pleasurable act done alone. Another would be something done with others. And another would be something meaningful, especially meaningful or important. For example, like self-care or even just like monitoring their blood sugar, something that has meaning for them. Personal strengths. This would be, you could go over a personal strengths inventory. There's a zillion online. Looking at what their strengths are, or you could just ask them what do you view as your personal strengths, and then select a strength to use deliberately in the next 24 hours. And then exploring with the person what that was like, or asking them to write it down. In this study, people were writing their reactions. And then values-based activities would be asking the person to select a principle that they hope to live by. For example, being kind to others or getting physically fit. And then again, as with the best possible self, make a small step towards connecting or reconnecting with this principle. And the most effective of these, all of them except for the forgiveness letter, showed some effectiveness in increasing hope and optimism. And the most effective were the gratitude letter, the personal strengths, and the personal strengths, and then the important, enjoyable, and meaningful activities. We can also help people to rediscover motivation and pleasure by using behavioral activation and behavioral experiments. Behavioral activation, breaking things into super small steps so that they can get closer and closer to what it is they're wanting to do. Behavioral experiment, asking the person to do something that they have been paralyzed or unmotivated to do and to predict the outcome. And then do an experiment to see, does that come true? We can encourage people to use cognitive behavior techniques and talk back to their thoughts. And for this, a simple way to put it with clients is the 3 C's. Catch the thought, check the thought, change the thought. So catch the thought. First, thinking about, what is it I'm thinking? And is this a cognitive distortion? Like all or nothing thinking or should statements. And then, is this thought valid and useful? Because a thought can be true without being distorted. Like, for example, we're all going to die. But is it useful to tell myself that 50 times a minute? You know, and to work with the person, to talk with them about what are some ways they might be able to challenge or change that thought. And so this stems from the idea that for many people, their thoughts are facts. They don't look at them to see if their thoughts actually are true. And so it can be useful to encourage people to ask themselves, is this thought a fact or a belief? And then the standard CBT questions. What's the evidence it's true? What's the evidence it's not true or mostly not true? How does it help me to tell myself that? How does it hurt me? And what could I tell myself instead? And you don't have to believe it. That's what I say to my clients. What you could tell yourself instead, you don't have to believe. Just play with it. Try different things on. I don't mean try or else you're a failure. I mean try different things on to see what fits and what doesn't. And these can generate coping statements. And ways to get at that would be when you tell yourself whatever it is they tell themselves, what's another way to look at it? Even if you don't believe it, what's another way to look at it? And I've said this before, you know, what do you most wish someone would say to you, and what might you say to somebody else? But for some people, changing thoughts isn't an option. Their thoughts are stubborn. And even sometimes changing thoughts can make them even stronger, just like thought suppression. Trying not to think of something can make it stronger. And this is where acceptance techniques come in. This is, oh wait, hold on. I skipped a slide. Oh yeah, so when thoughts can't be changed, responses to the thoughts can be changed. And this is where acceptance comes in and mindfulness comes in, and asking people to observe their thoughts as like the weather. You know, it comes and it goes, rather than thinking our thoughts are something enduring about ourself. And here is where acceptance and observation come in. You can ask the person to think of their thoughts as a train that's passing by. And you can watch the train pass, or you can jump on it and get carried away by it. You could think of thoughts as leaves on a river. You can watch them float by, or you can grab one and hold on to it. This next one has been amazingly powerful for my clients. To preface what they're telling themselves with, I'm having the thought that. So before I mention, somebody might say, I'm a loser, or what is it, I'm a total effing loser. And then to ask them to repeat that back with, I'm having the thought that, they say, I'm having the thought that I'm a total effing loser. And it feels different. I mean, it unilaterally, people tell me, yeah, that does feel different. And so we can help people cultivate witnessing their thoughts and feelings without over-identifying with them. Asking them to be like a commentator. Well, now I'm feeling sad. Now I'm feeling this. Now I'm feeling that. Can encourage them to not over-identify and to stay curious. And I mentioned this before, you know, I'm having the thought that I hate myself. I wonder why. Or I wonder how long this will last, you know. Somebody said to me once that they say when their depression comes back, hello, old friend. And that it's a way of sort of externalizing the problem. Behavior chain analysis I mentioned before, and I'm sorry that we're running out of time, but I do want to end on maintaining your own hope. And one of the important things that I think to maintain your own hope is to accept your limitations. I don't mean to encourage a nihilistic view of, oh, if somebody wants to kill themselves, there's nothing we can do to stop it or stop them, because there is. There's a lot. And we know that of people who, for example, were stopped from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, 90% were still alive decades later. So there are things we can do to stop people, but there are also times where we could do every single thing right, quote, quote. Every single thing we're told and advised to do, and it still may not work. And if we can accept our limitations, in some ways it can be liberating. It's sobering that we can't do everything, but it's also liberating because, I don't know if you know the quote, now that you know you don't have to be perfect, you can be good, which is by John Steinbeck. And so what I advise is reminding yourself, do everything you can, but know you can't do everything. And that can free up some of the fear and anxiety you have. Remember the successes. Remind yourself that most people, 99.7% of people who have serious suicidal thoughts do not die by suicide. That 0.3% is still tragic and devastating. I don't mean to diminish the importance of almost 50,000 people in this country dying by suicide. But the glass is 99.7% full, and it's useful to remind oneself of that. Definitely do not worry alone. Use consultation and supervision. Take good care of yourself. You know that spiel. And remember the rewards. We talk a lot about how stressful and scary, I talk about it, how stressful and scary it can be to work with people who have suicidal thoughts. But it also is deeply rewarding. There are few other situations where we have so much potential to help someone so profoundly. There's great potential for the person to change, grow, and heal. And personally, I view it as a privilege to be a part of that process. And on that note, I forgot to advance the slide. Yeah, I did that on purpose to make you laugh. It was very strategic. On that note, I am going to put up my contact information, and we had Q&A early. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm doing a book signing at 1:30 at the New Harbinger booth in the exhibition hall for my new book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. So if you want to drop by and say hi or ask your question, please feel free.